Hello, and welcome to the 8th Berwick Literary Festival, whether this is your first time or if you've already enjoyed previous events. My name is Helen Wright, and I'm a volunteer with the festival. Just to let you know that during the event, your cameras and microphones are switched off, but we would welcome any questions you might have for our speaker, which you can put into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So let's get cracking. I'm delighted to introduce Sasha Abramsky, whose latest book, Little Wonder, is the focus of this event. Hello, Sasha.
Hi, how are you today?
Fine, thank you very much, Sasha. I think it's morning where you're joining us from, is that right?
Yeah, I'm still drinking my coffee.
Right, great. And Sasha indeed joins us from California, where he's lived for many years, following his graduation from Oxford, where he read PPE. Sasha is a freelance journalist and author, and has written a number of books and articles highlighting issues of social justice and inequality. So this book marks a change in direction for him, and it's especially exciting to see that Little Wonder has found its place onto the long list for this year's Williams Hill Sports Book of the Year, described as the most prestigious sports writing award in the UK. Well done, Sasha.
Appreciate it, thank you.
Very exciting. The winner will not be announced until the 2nd of December, which gives us all plenty of time to read and reread about this remarkable woman, Lottie Dod. And if you've already read the book or you still have to read it, I'm sure you've been struck by the meticulous research, the appetizing bibliography, and it's kind of real kind of nostalgia thing as well, because Sasha reminds us of players from the past, such as Christine Truman, Helen Wills Moody, and so on. And he covers threads of social history. So we are reminded of Queen Victoria's Jubilee, the growth of popular media, Irish independence, and so on. And it's against that background that Lottie played hockey for England, British ladies golf champion, and so on and so on. And yet, Sasha, when I spoke with various friends and family, when I was preparing for this event, only one had heard of Lottie Dod. And the comment was, but I'm not sure from where. How did you come across her?
Completely randomly. My secret obsession is tennis. I've always been obsessed with tennis since I was about 3 or 4 years old. And my son's equally obsessed with tennis. So a few years back, just after Wimbledon finished, we were in the UK. And I arranged a tour. You can do these sort of behind the scenes tours of Wimbledon. So I took my son on a tour. And as part of that ticket, they had entry into the museum in the basement of the store. So I went down the basement and I toured around a bit. And in one corner, there was this little section on Victorian tennis champions. Mm-hmm. And I sort of pride myself on tennis trivia. I sort of think I know almost everything there is to know about tennis. And there was this little thing about this girl called Lottie Dod, who when she was 15 years old, won Wimbledon. And I did a double take because A, I'd never heard of her, and B, nobody wins Wimbledon at 15. It doesn't happen. And so I got into her story and I started researching. I phoned the library. I said, look, I'm here for a few days. Can I come back in? And they opened up their archives to me. And by the end of that week, I realized I stumbled on this extraordinary story. And like you said, nobody's heard of Lottie Dod. She's completely vanished from history. So it was sort of virgin territory in a way.
Okay. And well, before we go, not just about tennis, but her other sporting achievements, can you tell us a bit about her family background and her early life that might have led to her striving for success in this way?
She came from what was then new money. Her father in the mid-19th century had made a huge amount of money as a cotton merchant. He basically was an importer of cotton from the Americas. And the cotton merchants lived around Liverpool, and they sold cotton to the mills that were in Manchester and in other places in the Midlands. And in buying and selling cotton, they made absolute fortunes, and they were sort of seen as new money. They weren't quite respectable. They spent their money a little bit fast and loose. And so one of the ways that her family spent the money was on sports. They had this huge estate called Edgeworth, just outside Liverpool. Mm-hmm. And they built whatever the fad of the moment was. So they had croquet lawns, they had places they could play a bit of cricket, they had badminton, But in the mid-1870s, there was this game that had just been popularized called lawn tennis. And so Mr. Dodd put in 3 tennis courts, and there were 4 kids. Lottie was the youngest. And all of them became obsessed with tennis and obsessed with a whole bunch of other sports. And from what I can tell, they were a sort of gathering point that people would come from the neighborhood, extended family, friends, social partners. They'd come from the neighborhood and they'd play sports on the Edgeworth estate. And I think that was basically how Lottie Dod grew up.
And she had siblings, didn't she? You said there were 4.
She did. Her oldest sister was a woman called Anne, and she was nearly 10 years older than her. And she actually was the one who taught Lottie how to play and took her on the tennis circuit when she was a young kid. But then she had 2 brothers, William and Anthony. And from what I can tell, the 4 of them were sort of close as peas in a pod. The father died when they were quite young. The mother was this sort of rather overbearing, high Victorian. If you look at photos of her, she looks incredibly austere. She's sort of head to tail in black crepe, very heavy crepe outfits. And I think it was the 4 kids. They were self-sufficient. They never went to school. They always were homeschooled by governors and governesses. And they created this sort of mini world, a little bit like a generation later in literature. The Mitford sisters did the same thing. They were a sort of sporting equivalent to the Mitford sisters.
Yeah, I mean, what I found interesting in the book, and you kind of touched on it there, was the idea that they did have this very controlling mother who kind of became more so, especially when father died, and that sport was a kind of a good excuse to get away from home for a bit. That was all right to do that. And I think you say that by 11, Lottie was attracting attention already with her tennis prowess as she went around regional championships. Can you tell us a bit about her route to Wimbledon between when she was 11 and when she was 15?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of summed it up. Basically, when she was 11, her older sister started taking her on the circuit, and they played doubles together and then also some singles. And they started winning tournaments, and they were winning tournaments against the best of the best. You know, there weren't that many women tennis players at that point. It was a very new sport. Wimbledon had only let women in 1877, I think. But there were enough top players that if an 11-year-old was beating them, the sporting world noticed. And there was a really vibrant sports media at that point. There were sports periodicals. The newspapers often had sports events on the front pages. And they loved Lottie Dod. And so by the time she was 13 or 14, wherever Lottie Dod went, the media followed her. And they started giving her this nickname, the Little Wonder, because she was so precocious and she was hitting the ball so hard. And she was doing things on the tennis court that women, especially in the 1880s, just weren't supposed to do. She was really, really running her opponents from side to side. She was volleying. She was playing this aggressive game. So she gets to Wimbledon at 15, and she's either the favorite or the second favorite, and she wins. You know, she basically runs through the field, wins the event, and I think her prize money was a couple shillings and a gift certificate to Harrods or something, or whatever the equivalent of Harrods was then. There was no real money involved. It was just done for the honor of the game. And she loved the honor of the game. She loved accumulating trophies. She loved, I think she loved the attention that went with it, though it may have been a bit ambivalent. I think at times the media coverage got to her a bit. But she was good in the spotlight, and she knew that she had a fan following. She knew that people were writing songs about her. She knew they were chanting her name in the stands, and she loved it. She lapped it up.
However, you tell us that she actually stopped playing competitively when she was 21. So when other people are just starting, she actually retired from tennis. And I think there was reminiscent of Billie Jean King and others. She had kind of invited challenges from male players and she'd beaten them and, you know, all of kind of that. But then she formed a very influential friendship with someone called Elizabeth Main, and that led to her spending time in Switzerland. So we've switched from tennis now to the Cresta Run. I wonder if you could tell us more about the Cresta Run and again, Dod's experiences in that context.
Well, I'll back into that, but first I'll say a little bit more about the tennis, because what she did in tennis in that period between 15 and 21 was unprecedented. She won Wimbledon 5 times in that 6 or 7 year span, and the 2 years she didn't win, it was because she wasn't playing. She had to take a break, not quite sure why, probably her mother basically forced her. But by the time she was 21, she'd won 40-something tennis tournaments, including 5 Wimbledons, and she got bored. and this would sort of become a pattern throughout her life. She'd conquer, or competition was too easy, and so she'd move on to another sport. She needed this sort of constant adrenaline rush. So in the mid-1890s, she moves to Switzerland in the winters. There's this very fashionable new winter resort town called St. Moritz, which still exists and is still fashion. And she was in a place called the Kulm Hotel. And the Kulm Hotel was where the sort of European and American adventuring aristocracy would winter. They'd go there, well, they weren't skiing yet. Skiing came a little bit later, but they'd toboggan, they'd mountain climb, they'd ice skate, they'd invent these sports like ice cricket. They did all kinds of weird things. And Lottie Dod got better and better and better at all of these winter sports. And there was this new thing, this Cresta run, which was this diabolically difficult toboggan run that had been carved out of the ice in St. Moritz. And all of the top male daredevils of the world basically would come there, because bear in mind, there were no airplanes then, there were no automobiles then. The fastest trains on Earth went at about 60 miles an hour. And if you hurtled down the Cresta run, you were going at 70 something miles an hour, which meant you were going faster than any other human being on Earth. And it was thought to be impossible for women. And Lottie Dod said, you know, to hell with that. Of course, it's not impossible. And she trained and she trained and she trained. And she got down. She did the Cresta run in one go, top to bottom, and was one of the only women to do it in more than 100 years. The toboggan course responded not long afterwards by banning women, and they were only weighted, I think it was 2 years ago. So for an awfully long time, Lottie had that record to herself pretty much.
Okay, and you've mentioned Switzerland and mountain sports, and we know that she got into mountaineering and she went to Norway again with this friend that I've mentioned, Elizabeth Mayne. And then she plays hockey for England. But then her next big thing was golf. And I found this part of the book quite interesting, because I'd got used to a woman who was successful at everything, reached the top, moved on. But what I was interested in was your account of her time in the States and what happened to her in regard to her golfing success or not. And could you kind of elaborate on that? And was she someone who couldn't travel with sport?
No, she was actually very good at traveling with sport. So when she was in Switzerland, she was top of the game. She actually trained to the male level of excellence in ice skating. She was one of the best male skaters as a woman in the world. She was extremely good at traveling. But you're right, she wins the British Golf Championship. She's the ladies golf champion in 1904. And by then she's in her 30s. She has a huge fan following, not just in England, but around the British Empire and also in the United States, which was just fascinating. The media loved the story of Lottie Dod, and fashionable young ladies from America, when they were on the European circuit, would look up Lottie Dod at society parties. It was a sort of, big fan thing. But she gets an invite to go and play some golf tournaments in America after she wins the British Golf Championship. And she goes there, it's sort of a 3 or 4 month sojourn, and she starts off, devastatingly strong. She wins everything at first, and then she fades, and she starts losing events that she wouldn't have been expected to lose. And she starts picking up some quite snide, nasty comment media, because the media, whether it's in America in 1904-5 or whether it's in, the UK or America today, the media likes watching somebody take a fall. And she took a fall. She started losing to lesser known American golf players. And I think there were a few reasons. I think one was just exhaustion. She had just done too much for too long. One was the weather. She was used to playing in rather lush, green, wet conditions in England. And suddenly she's in America and it's, hot and it's humid. And, she was on the East Coast when, at the tail end of summer with this brutal humidity, and she didn't adapt very well. I think the last thing was a medical issue, and I'm not sure the exact details, but she increasingly was hobbled by sciatica. And anyone who's had sciatica knows how painful it is. She was suffering sciatica when she was playing in America at that period, and she eventually had enough. Her body broke down. She couldn't take it. She basically arranged with the steamer company to take her home early, and she took a ship back to Liverpool. And as far as I know, that was the last time she visited, the west of the Atlantic. She went around Europe afterwards, but I don't think she came back to the Americas.
Yes, I kind of, there was that sense of disappointment, and I kind of felt for her at that point. And yet we come back to the UK, and a fascinating part of the book for me was the 1908 Olympics. And I was really taken aback by some of the history that you offer to us about the development of the modern Olympics. And it was Pierre de Coubertin's opposition to female athletes, which I didn't realize had been such a battle. And Pierre de Coubertin, who is the father, so-called, of the modern Olympics, if I could just read what you wrote, that his concern was that women athletes would be a source of titillation. And he also claimed that the best non-monetary prize for men is female applause. And there's more. But the Olympics was then Dod getting into archery. So could you comment a bit on the Olympics bit and also what she did in archery, how she got into it, and indeed what she achieved?
Yeah, well, let me start with how she got into archery, because that's how she gets to the Olympics.
Yeah.
So she had been among all the other sports at Edgeworth when she was a child, was archery. And the family legend had it that one of their ancestors was called John Dod, and he was Dod of Edge, and he had been an archer at Agincourt, and he'd been knighted on the field afterwards. Mm-hmm. And the family had named the estate Edgeworth Estate in honor of this ancient ancestor, John Dod of Edge. And they'd always had archery as a sort of part of their self-mythology. And so she'd done that as a kid, and then she sort of put it to one side because she was training in tennis, and then she was training in golf and all these other sports. And then when she sort of played through golf and tennis in particular, after her mother died, she and her siblings all moved to southern England. She and her two brothers moved to Newbury, and her sister by then was married and living in North London. And Lottie and at least one of her brothers, William, started training at a local aristocratic estate, this beautiful old estate that sort of could trace its time back to Henry VIII. And they started training in archery there. And both of them became excellent, excellent archers. And when the 1908 Olympics came around, it was originally supposed to be in Italy, I believe. And there were all kinds of complications because the Italian government hadn't worked out the sort of logistics, and they hadn't arranged the investments to build the site. And so at sort of relatively short notice, the English stepped in and said, we'll do it. And they built White City. It was part of the exposition in White City, this huge, beautiful, temporary sort of thing that was built to look spectacular and then be demolished. And the Olympics were part of that. And there was a huge stadium. It was a stadium which at the time was the biggest in the world. And the king opened it, and the royal family sort of would continually come in. And it was really this spectacle. The weather was atrocious. I mean, even beyond usual British atrocious weather, it was just rainy and windy every single day. But the events went on. And William, Lottie's brother, ended up winning a gold medal in archery. And Lottie, who was then in her late 30s and very, very badly hobbled by sciatica, ended up winning the silver medal. And it was the first time a brother-sister combo had won an Olympic medal. And there were only about 30 women in the Olympics. There were thousands of male participants, but there were, I think, 30-something or maybe 40-something women. And Lottie was one of them.
Incredible. Throughout the book, you do throw, and you've touched on a bit of it just now, allusions as to what might have made her tick. You describe her as tailor-made for stardom, and as you've already said this afternoon, but she became a bit bored by the stardom. And you refer to something that she wrote, and she said, "Better to excel as an athlete than fade into obscurity as a wife." Yeah. What is your conclusion about what drove her, sometimes dilettante-like, which is another phrase that you use, from one sport to another? I mean, you've covered the family background thing and the fact she was exposed at a young age to different activities, and she had this sort of vibrant life with her siblings. But what kind of, was she just a sort of butterfly?
No, I think that's unfair to her. She was a woman of her time and period. She was independently wealthy because she'd inherited money when her father died. She didn't need to work, and indeed it was frowned upon at that point for women of her social status to work. And so she had an awful lot of free time. And she was a deeply unconventional person. You know, if you think of the sort of Victorian adventuring classes, they were eccentric, they loved to travel, they loved to explore the world, and they loved doing it on their own terms, which made them both, you know, fascinating, but also, you know, annoying if you were outside of that circle. She was very much part of that. She had the resources to do whatever she wanted, and she wanted to dance to her own tune. She had no truck with social conventions. She didn't want to get married. She didn't want to have kids. She would mountaineer with her friend Lizzie Main, and they'd go a little bit off the beaten path, and they'd strip down from there, because at the time women were wearing corsets and full-length dresses. And as soon as they were out of view, they'd take the clothes off and they'd put on male trousers, because those are much more functional for, you know, climbing a mountain in. I think she just was somebody who liked dancing to her own tune, and going from one sport to another was her way of expressing that. And I think she also must have had a fiercely competitive instinct. I mean, if you look at the achievements that she did over a quarter of a century at the top of about 7 or 8 different sports, I don't think there's any other sports person, male or female, maybe with the exception of an American woman called Babe Dickerson Zarius, but there's almost nobody else with that range of sporting accomplishments at the very, very highest level.
What's very clear is your passion, your kind of intrigue, and you know, your sense of great curiosity about Dod and what she achieved, and you're giving her due recognition there. In terms of a biographer and feeling something for their subject, did you like her? Do you like her? Or is it more an admiration? Did you get a sense of the woman, or are you looking her purely in terms of what she achieved?
No, I think I liked her. I mean, she's a bit of a mystery to me, especially the second half of her life. She vanishes. I mean, she goes from being one of the most famous women in England to being essentially anonymous. And World War I's the cutoff point. She becomes a nurse in World War I. And after that, for the last more than 40 years of her life, I don't think she had any desire to be in the spotlight. So that part of her life's an enigma to me. You know, I can sort of piece it together, but I don't really have a sense of her as a personality. The first half of her life, there's so much documented evidence, including her own writings, that it's, you know, relatively easy to get a bead on who she was. And I think I like that person. I think she's somebody who, if I'd been alive 120 years ago, I would have quite liked to hang out with her. That, you know, she was fun. She knew how to tell stories, and she knew how to engage with people. And as I said, she strikes me as being eminently eccentric, and I think that's that's always a personality trait I find fascinating.
In one of your online pieces, kind of the political line of your writing, you record how over time, and this is you quoting, "The more I realise how little each one of us is in the grand scheme of things." And I was struck by the structure of your book, which begins and ends, the main part of the book, with Dod's dying moments in a care home in the south of England. Why did you choose to frame your narrative in this way?
Because the death itself, without spoiling the plot of the book, but the death itself was so lonely and anonymous. And this is somebody who at her prime was, you know, there was Queen Victoria and there were a few other, you know, very, very famous women in England, but at her prime, she really was a headline grabber. And when she died, she was nearly 90 and the world had moved on. You know, she'd come of age in the Victorian period, driving around the countryside on a horse and cart, and she dies in the nuclear age and the space age. And the world had moved completely away from her and her story and her milieu. And, you know, as someone who writes and thinks a lot about history, I find that fascinating. There's transience, the impermanence of even someone with the accomplishments of Lottie Dod. The fact that time tends to erase so much. And so it seemed to me a very good place to open, you know, because then it allowed me to segue back in and try and sort of tell the story of how this woman goes from superstardom, or the late 19th century equivalent of superstardom, to dying alone in a nursing home with no family, nobody who really was there to care about her. A few nephews and nieces scattered around the world who she left various things to. But basically, she had been forgotten.
And yeah, and I think there was for me, as possibly my question reflected, a poignancy in all of that, that the vigor of the woman, the impact that she'd had, and yet, particularly towards the end of her life, how that was as if nothing to those around her. And you reflect towards the end of the book again on how her caregivers might view her frailty, because that's their only view of Dod herself. But you also suggest that in her prime, she could claim to be one of the greatest sportswomen ever seen. In her prime. Where would you place her now, thinking about other sportswomen of the 20th and 21st century, or indeed not just women, men too? Where would you place her?
It's difficult because so many things change, and sport's one of those areas where things change at breakneck pace. So the technology changes, the training changes. You know, if you think about running years ago, or whenever it was that Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, that was seen as, you know, absolutely extraordinary. And now any good college athlete will break the 4-minute mile. You have to get another half-minute in or whatever to be world class. Same in tennis. You know, you look at the racket technology today and you compare it to the nearly 1 pound clunky wooden racket that she was holding. You know, so the racket today is about a quarter of the way to the racket she was holding. The string technology is different. Everything is different. And so, you know, I'm always suspicious. You know, there's this great debate at the moment. Who's the greatest of all time? Federer, Nadal, Djokovic. And that debate sort of makes sense, at least for aficionados, because they're all contemporaries. But if you then sort of take it back and say, well, is Federer better than Rod Laver, for example, who won 2 Grand Slams? Well, he hits the ball harder. He's got a, you know, serve that does more spin and everything else, but that's at least in part because the technology is so different. So, you know, Lottie Dod was born 150 years ago this year. She was playing competitively 135 years ago. That said, if you look at her raw achievements, that by the age of 21, she'd won 5 Wimbledons, she'd won 40-something tennis tournaments. And then you look at all the other achievements in golf and everything else that we've talked about. She's clearly one of the greatest sportswomen of all time. You know, you mentioned Billie Jean King. In 1973, Billie Jean King beat an aging, not particularly healthy, not particularly fit Bobby Riggs in the Battle of the Sexes. In 1888, 85 years earlier, in 1888, when Lottie Dod was 16 years old, she challenged 3 men to tennis duels. And they weren't has-beens. They were the current Wimbledon champion, a recent ex-Wimbledon champion, and the Scottish champion. They were her contemporaries. She beat 2 of the 3 of them. Now, admittedly, they gave her a handicap. She was starting each game with a 2-point lead. But she demolished them, including William Renshaw, who won Wimbledon 7 times. So, you know, that alone, I think, says that she is up there in the pantheon of truly, truly great tennis players, at least, and I suspect in the other sports as well.
We've got a couple of questions come in, Sasha. The first from Jerry Foley, who says, without being too prurient, did her friendship with her travelling companion, Lizzie Mayne, ever develop into anything more substantial or intimate?
It's a great question. You're not being prurient at all. And the answer is, I don't know. I have my suspicions. It seems quite likely. I mean, it was a very, very intense friendship they had. And Lizzie Mayne was this sort of also very eccentric, larger-than-life character. She had been married twice before or 3 times before, including to this swashbuckling military adventurer called Colonel Gustavus Barnaby. What a wonderful name. And he had died a hero's death in the Sudan. And then she married somebody else and he died. And she was in her 30s by then. And she was living very much to her own, you know, dancing to her own tune in Switzerland. They had a very intense friendship. And when you look, Lizzie Mayne was one of the great photographers of her age, and she took her camera everywhere. And those photos still exist in archives all over the place. And when you look at some of the captions that she hand wrote on the photos of Lottie Dod, they're very flirtatious, and some of them are quite coquettish. But there's no love letters I could find. There's nothing like that. So the answer is, I don't know if there was anything more than a friendship, but it certainly wouldn't be implausible to me. And certainly Lottie Dod didn't seem to have any interest in her life in romance, but especially not in male romance. There's just no sense that there were suitors after her, no sense that if there were suitors, she was interested in them. That whole part of her life seems to be a sort of gap. And given the moral strictures in Victorian England, or just Victorian England, that gap could have contained secrets, but they would have been very well hidden because so much was at stake in not revealing. If she was gay, had she revealed it, I mean, think what happened to Oscar Wilde in that same time period. If she had been gay and it had come out, it would have been a scandal. So the answer is, I don't know, but one can draw one's own conclusions, I think.
And I think one of her brothers too didn't marry, or
her brother William, and actually they lived with each other from World War I onwards. Most of the time they were either living together in her house in Earl's Court, or they were living together in his house in southern England in a place called Westwood Ho in Devon. And they never married, neither of them married.
And we have a question from Valerie Bistrom. Do you think in the modern era there would ever be another woman, or indeed person, who could excel in the range of numerous sports that Lottie did?
I mean, it's hard to say never, but I'd say unlikely, because there's so much hyper specialization in sport now. You have to start training so young, it becomes all encompassing. Again, if you look at some of the current tennis players, people like Nadal, when they were kids, they were very good at soccer. Nadal was very good at soccer in particular. But the idea of co-training in sports, the risk of injury, if you're a tennis player and you're playing soccer or football, the risk of injury to your hands is extreme. If you're a tennis player today, you're training 6, 7, 8 hours a day. You're not just sort of going onto the court and then leaving. So it's hard to say never, but it's also hard to see how somebody could go through that many different sports. Maybe 2 or 3 sports, but the idea of becoming world-class in 7 or 8, that I struggle with.
Are you also someone who struggles with the idea that we have become over-specialized, or do you just recognize that as something that was inevitable?
I mean, I think to a degree it is what it is, that it's partly to do with the professionalization of sports, and that's not a bad thing, because it opens up sports to people who aren't independently wealthy. Whereas in Lottie Dod's day, sport was all amateur, and so you either had another job and you did it on the side, or you had to have a lot of money that could cushion you, and you could take your time to excel in sports. But I think the downside of professionalization is, it does result in people having these sort of maybe 5, 10, 15-year careers, if they're lucky, 15 years, and then not knowing what to do with the rest of their lives. And so they go off, they become sports coaches, or they become commentators, or they just sort of vanish. Kinds of other interests. So, when she was no longer able to be a top-level athlete, she trained as a nurse. And after World War I, she was a really good singer, a sort of concert-quality singer. And she joined a very well-known madrigal society run by a very famous composer and conductor called C.K. Scott. And for many, many years, she toured the country singing, and she performed at Buckingham Palace. And, she had all kinds of other interests. And I think one of the things you lose in hyper-specialization is that ability to continue your life as a full life after your sports glory days end.
Yeah, because I got a real sense, I mean, I hadn't mentioned the singing, but I got a real sense at that point in her life, she got great fulfillment from that more kind of cultural activity. So, yeah. Can I encourage our viewers to post some more questions? Now, I did notice that in your primary dedication at the front of the book, you mention your grandmother, Mim, and you refer to her as our tiny dancer. Well, the book itself, all about Little Wonder, that kind of really captured my imagination, but I was really intrigued by that. And I was wondering if you could tell us about your tiny dancer, and why the book was dedicated to her.
Well, I was lucky. When I was growing up, I had 4 wonderful, extraordinary grandparents. I've written about my British grandparents. I wrote a book called The House of 20,000 Books about their world in London. My granddad was a sort of massive intellectual polymath. My grandma loved nothing more than hosting people. We'd host thousands. I mean, they had dinners one after the other, and there were thousands of books surrounding us. So that was my English side. My American side, my granddad was a violinist in Los Angeles, and my grandmother had trained as a modern dancer in the 1920s and early 30s, and had performed in modern dance in New York before moving out to California with my granddad. And I go back and forth who I dedicate my books to. Sometimes my kids, sometimes one grandparent or another. And in this case, Mim was about 4'11", my grandma, and she was a complete adventurer and never stopped traveling. After she was widowed, when she was in her late 70s and she was widowed, she started traveling even more. And so, she'd go with friends to Morocco or Alaska, or she went down the Copper Canyon train route in Mexico, just all kinds of adventurous stuff. And when she died, at her funeral, my cousin Lauren, one of the songs she played was Tiny Dancer by Elton John. Because it's all about this little dancer in Los Angeles who wears blue jeans and everything else and goes on adventures. And it seemed so appropriate. So in this case, just because something about Lottie Dod, even though Lottie Dod was a big, tall woman and my grandma Mim was a tiny, tiny woman, something about Lottie Dod's personality sort of reminded me of my grandma. So I dedicated the book to her.
And where next? I mean, are you planning to move more onto sports writing, or is this just a one-off because it caught your imagination at that museum?
It could be a one-off, but I mean, on a daily basis, I write a lot about politics. I write a lot about sort of cultural issues in the US, and I teach journalism. I mean, that's basically how I earn my keep. Increasingly, the books I've written, I mean, I wrote a whole bunch of books on criminal justice, on poverty, on hunger, all the social justice themes. But 2 of my recent books have been more historical. The one on my grandparents, The House of 20,000 Books, and then this one. And to be honest, I love it. It's a sort of, it's a break from the daily, not the grind, but it's a break from the daily sort of, obsession with politics. And in current day America, with all the chaos and craziness around politics, it's not bad to have a sort of safety valve. So I may well end up doing another book at some point, more like the Lottie Dod book and less like some of my other social justice books.
And very specifically, Joyce Guthrie asks whether you have identified your next writing project specifically.
No, I haven't actually. I'm immersed in sort of quick turnaround journalism pieces and figure I'll stay immersed that way for a few more months and then come up with a book idea.
And we have another couple of questions come in from Scott Sherrard. Another Olympian of that time whose story Scott loves is Sophie Pierce, later Lady Heath, a world-class flyer. Why do you think that these amazing women are so easily forgotten?
Well, I have to admit, I have never heard of Lady Heath. So can I possibly push that back to the audience member? And maybe you could tell me a little bit more, either in the Q&A or if you can turn your microphone on, about who this wonderful woman is.
Well, I don't think Scott will be able to turn the microphone on, but if in the Q&A, Scott, you could just put in a little summary and we'll see whether it rings a bell for Sasha.
Maybe while you're doing that, there's one other question. I think maybe I can answer the other question and then come back to this Lady Heath.
And we have a question from Michael Wright, which is a personal challenge, I think. Are you attracted to successful sports people or just successful people?
No, I think there's something about sports that I really find compelling. Successful business people can take it or leave it, but there's something about conquering in the world of sports that I think is just a marvelous part of the human story. And it isn't success per se. I think it's skill and dedication. That's what really intrigues me, because you don't get to the top of a sport without tremendous gumption. You have to really put in your all. And that's always fascinated me.
Okay, and I think we've got an offer here to put on Scott's microphone. So, Peter, if we could arrange that, please. Great. And if Scott could unmute.
Hello.
Hooray! Hello, Scott.
Hello. No, it was just intriguing. If you don't know her, she was an Irish woman who was one of the very early Olympians. So she did a lot of athletics, high jump, etc. Most people reckon she cheated her way to her Olympic gold medal, but she was an extraordinarily old woman who then took up flying, and in I think 1916 was the first person to do a loop-the-loop, and in person, not woman, but first person to do a loop-to-loop in a biplane. She also walked the wings in the biplane. It's just an extraordinary career, but she actually played a very important part in letting women become Olympic athletes, so that she was very involved in all of the movement to enable that, and right through to about the late 20s. She sadly died falling down the stairs of a London bus when she was 40. But no, I was just interested with the story, because I think that I think these women should be remembered and should be revered, and somehow I'm really intrigued as to how they became, if you like, unfamous. Sophie Pearce, when she became Lady Heath, and she clearly became Lady Heath to get the money to fly more. So her husband was about 80 years old, not particularly interested in her, and she wasn't particularly interested in him, but she managed to get the funding. She was the first woman to fly from South Africa to London ever on her own, which was also quite astonishing. But and I came across her because I read in the newspaper that she had performed in front of 10,000 people at Caird Hall in Dundee, which is where I came from. And I thought, if you could attract 10,000 people, how have I never heard of her? Mm-hmm. That's why I'm so fascinated with your story, because I've not really heard of Lottie Dod. So it's exciting. Sorry.
No, thank you very much. Thank you. Sasha.
That's an absolutely fascinating story, and I'm going to have to look up Heath now in more detail. And the answer is, I think two things happened. Number one, people like Lady Heath and Lottie Dod, by and large, were operating just before the era of mass movable media. So, you know, there were cameras and there were newspapers, but there weren't moving images, and there weren't radio interviews, and there weren't TV interviews. Yep. In Lady Heath's case, if she was flying, it was 10, 15 years after Lottie Dod. So there may be some more moving film footage of her. But I think basically there's an awful lot of stories that get lost when they aren't digitally preserved somehow, or analog, in analog archives to be digitalized later on. I think that's number one. It's just the sort of happenstance of when they were operating. But I think the other thing is there was a really concerted effort by sporting elites, and Helen was talking about it with Pierre Coubertin. There was a real reaction in the 1910s and 1920s against women athletes, and the medical profession got involved, and the psychiatry profession got involved, and popular culture turned against women athletes. And I think they really ended up with a tsunami of, it wasn't even negative publicity, it was an absence of publicity. There was this growing assumption that they were interlopers in a male world. And it was, I think, a reaction against the broader achievements of feminism in the early part of the 20th century, the suffragette movement, the fact that women gradually were entering the workforce. And I think this was a reaction. And I think one of the consequences was that these stories got buried. Another way of thinking about it is when marginalized groups try to become less marginalized, or when marginalized groups, individuals from within them, do things that are sort of by and large extraordinary, the dominant culture sometimes sort of pushes back and makes us forget. Another example would be, there was a Black composer in France in the late 18th century, a man called Joseph Bologna, and he was every bit as famous in his time as Mozart. But nobody's heard of Joseph Bologna today, or if a few aficionados have. But he basically got written out of 19th century history as the 19th century became more sort of racially rigid. And I think that, you know, a similar thing happened with women athletes in the late 19th century, that in the early 20th, they got written out of history.
Fascinating.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. I think if we could perhaps move on to our last question, Sasha, which has come from Mike Fraser and kind of touches a bit on what you're just reflecting on. And Mike says, there's a great need to rescue the stories of so many women. How easy was it to research Lottie?
Well, in Lottie Dod's case, there is a ton of stuff out there for the first half of her life. There are scrapbooks that she put together that are in the Wimbledon archives and in family archives. There are archives in Switzerland. There are archives in America. There are archives in various different sporting museums and so on. And there's also a ton of newspaper coverage. And one of the developments that's wonderful for a researcher in the last few years has been things like websites like newspapers.com, which allow you to search at speed for complete needles in haystacks. And it turns out when you key in Lottie Dod and a few other keywords, there were thousands of newspaper articles. And if you don't mind rummaging through them, they come up scattershot on newspapers.com. There's very little coherence to it. But if you don't mind doing a sort of digital rummage, you can get a ton of material. So it wasn't easy to research Lottie Dod, but it was possible. But I suspect there were other athletes who were slightly less in the public eye, who didn't get written about quite as often, and their stories have probably largely vanished at this point.
Okay, if I could also just share with the people who are with us, Sasha. Sasha has to collect somebody very shortly from Sacramento Airport. So we're going to have to start winding down. And I'd like to start by thanking you very much, Sasha, for this session, for answering the questions so readily, and for reminding me actually why I found this book so fascinating and interesting, because it really is. And so the book, Little Wonder, is available from Greaves in Berwick or any good bookshop. I'd like to thank you all for joining the Berwick Literary Festival this evening / morning. And please mention this event in any of your social media posts. And if you've enjoyed the session, please consider making a donation to the festival to help us flourish further in our work as an educational charity. And details about how you can donate will be on the slides in the closing moments. So thank you to you all for joining us. Many thanks, Sasha. We look forward to seeing you and perhaps even Sasha in Berwick in October 2022.
I would love that. That was a lot of fun. Thank you all.
Oh, thank you. Good night.